In my childhood days, oh Lord, many long years ago.
I want to welcome you to our second panel discussion. We are not where we were. How do we get back? The exploration of the relationship between the African American and the Jewish communities. This has been an exciting 2 weeks starting of our panel discussions, and I do want to mention before we begin there are two more coming up. One with Gilbert King, and the second one, an oral history of the civil rights in Sarasota. So we hope that you attend those as well. But without further ado, I would like to bring out our panelists for you to meet. Thank you. To my left, right here, is the Honorable Judge Charles E. Williams of the 12th District Court, who's been instrumental in all of our panels, as well as our outreach program on Thurgood. Rabbi Jeff Hunting is right next to him from the Temple Sinai of Sarasota. Pastor John Walker at Bethel CME Church, Newtown. Rabbi Howard Simon, an ordained rabbi for a long time and also an author. Dr. Eddie Renier, psychologist, Assessment Psychotherapy Service. Mr. Howard Tevelowitz, the executive director of the Jewish Federation. Lawrence Eager, our public defender of the 12th District Court and president of the Minnesota Legal Aid. And Uzi Baram, anthropology professor at New College, who is our guest moderator today. So thank you so much for coming, all of you. We really appreciate your time and effort on this project. I'd like to turn it to Uzi.
Thank you, Kate. I'm here with three roles. One, I'm Jewish. I belong to Temple Emmanuel here in Sarasota. In my training as an archaeologist, I've worked in Sarasota documenting a historic black cemetery near Newtown, the Galilee Cemetery, and I worked towards revealing the location of early 19th century Maroon community on the Manatee River, the community of Angola, which got me involved in many of the issues surrounding African diasporic history. But I'm mainly here as an anthropologist. Anthropology as a discipline was developed to understand the differences among human beings. In the 19th century, anthropologists worked hard to create the differences that led to classifications that we call race. Those notions of race were debated, argued, a whole science developed to try to make sense of how people were different over the 19th century. And then by the late 19th century, early 20th century, politicians started using those ideas to divide people up. By the mid-20th century, 3 places on the planet took race and made it their official policy. Nazi Germany, Jim Crow southern states in the United States, and apartheid South Africa. Anthropologists, in seeing the results of this race notion, taking the understandings and misunderstandings of human differences that were used to oppress people, subordinate people, rose up to try to overturn it. And within the United States in particular, many people stood up to try to change those laws and to give everyone the opportunity to reach full personhood. We're here tonight to look at 2 of the groups which have suffered historically because of the race concept. Jews, due to the policies in Europe in the mid-20th century when extermination was the answer for dealing with a group seen as separate, and African Americans who were subordinated and terrorized all through the United States for just being who they were. And so we're going to try to explore these 2 groups, understand their relationships, through the stories from these panelists. Judge Williams will talk about those two groups for us.
As you know, the play Thurgood deals with the historical context of the modern civil rights movement through the eyes of one person and the voice of one person, Thurgood Marshall. But I think that we need to have a historical context of the movement as it relates to our topic tonight. Jews were an important presence in the civil rights movement. About half of the white civil rights attorneys in the South in the 1960s were Jews. More than half of the white freedom riders in the 1960s were Jews. And nearly 2/3 of the white volunteers involved in Freedom Summer in Mississippi in 1964 were Jews. Two of them, Andrew Goodman and Michael Schwerner, were murdered, along with James Chaney. Jews also provided much of the funds for the NAACP, the Congress of Racial Equality, and other civil rights organizations. And as we know, those of you who have seen the play Thurgood, in the landmark 1954 Brown versus Board of Education ruling itself, the Supreme Court accepted the research of the black sociologist Dr. Kenneth Clark that segregation placed a stamp of inferiority on black children. Dr. Clark's study had been commissioned by the American Jewish Committee.
Thank you, Judge Williams. In the story that Thurgood Marshall tells of his life, he mentions an episode in his youth when he was working for a hat merchant. And he was taking some hats on delivery on a city bus, and a person on the bus shoved him and used a term, which I think we'll all be familiar with, but I won't be using, to describe the person who would end up being a Supreme Court justice. The young Thurgood Marshall was upset both at what happened on the bus and they couldn't do the delivery and not be able to fulfill his job. Went back to the merchant in tears, as the story goes, and the merchant, who is Jewish, said very clearly, what's important is to fight against that racist, not the hats. It gives a sense of pride for those of us who are Jewish that the merchant said that was what's seen as important. I want to start the discussion and leave it open to whoever wants to start providing commentary. What was the ideal period for blacks and Jews in this country in fighting for civil rights and against racism?
I think the time that was ideal was in the early 60s, mid-60s and beyond. Speaking very personally, I was ordained as a rabbi in June of 1963. I went to my congregation in Baltimore, Maryland, and in the middle of July of that year, received an invitation that was sent to all of the clergy in the Baltimore area, inviting us to attend a lecture that was going to be given by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. at Goucher College. He wanted to talk to us, as it stated, about something very, very important. It was a time when I went and shared the audience with a number of rabbis, number of Christian clergy, number of African American clergy, all of us sitting together, all of us listening to Dr. King, who was there to invite us to be at the August March. He wanted to be sure we would be in Washington, D.C., and after his talk, and as inspiring as it was, no one left that auditorium without the realization that, yes, if we hadn't made plans, we would make plans now to be at the march in Washington. I think those were kind of the halcyon days in which African American community, the Jewish community, joined together in realizing what was so vitally important and wanted to listen to, hear, and understand everything that Dr. King had to say.
For me, the ideal period was when I was a boy at this time. I was very young. I had a friend in the 60s whose name was John Reeb. His father was a pastor. And as young boys at that period, we enjoyed doing things together. Scourge around in the neighborhood, collecting items, looking for trouble, getting into some trouble. John Reed was white. I was black. In the background was the civil rights movement. And we had no idea what it was about. I mean, we had no idea how our lives was going to be forever changed. But in that summer, we were about 11, 12, having a grand time, carefree. We heard that terrible word that still haunts me today, that N-word. And John didn't know what that meant, and I knew what it meant. A weekend, we heard that John's father was the reverend going to go to a civil rights movement in the South. And Sunday, we all went to a service. I was Catholic, he was not. And his father left that Sunday. We were never to see him again. John Reed's father was killed. One of the three civil rights workers was killed. And the civil rights movement came home loudly. But before that moment, as a young boy, I had a relationship with a white boy. At a time that was not sanctioned. At a time it was terrible. And he suffered because of that relationship, and so did I. When we talked to his father about it, I didn't have a father. He was our mutual father. When I talked to him, he said, you shouldn't worry about what the world thinks of your relationship. And we approached it that way. We were called names. He was called an N-lover. And it didn't change his relationship with me. I tell you to this day, because after his father died, the family moved away, and I lost my friendship. I don't know what that friendship would have evolved into had it continued. Till this day, I miss John, and I miss our relationship.
We're talking about the best of times? Is that what we're talking about right now? Well, I guess going in the years, in many ways, I'm still a child of the 60s. And I was on the college campus in Baltimore, Johns Hopkins University, in that summer when the civil rights workers that the judge just referred to were killed. And I remember the organizing on our campus, the excitement that kind of engendered among all of us. And I also remember the disproportionate number of Jewish students who were involved in supporting that movement. And so in a certain sense, on one way, we were not in the leadership, as Rabbi Simon was talking about as being a leader, hearing Dr. King. We were really on a much lower level, but it was a wonderfully healthy level, maybe closer to the doctor in a certain sense of personal relationships on that college campus and other college campuses, by the way, joining with the women from Goucher College, by the way, at that particular time in Baltimore. So I think for me on a personal level, those time in the 60s where we identified with each other as communities that had suffered discrimination and found a common cause and the energy that brought us into that movement together.
I think to expand on that commonality, that it wasn't just personal friendships, although those are important. Of course, listening to the recordings of Martin Luther King Jr., one can understand how he moved people. But there are a lot of people with wonderful visions who aren't heard. They were heard. That vision was heard in the 60s. Why was it heard?
You know, the broader question that I have is what led to this alliance? You know, what, from a historical point of view, from a philosophical point of view, from a practical perspective, what made it so that these Jewish students, many of them college students, many of them 18, 19 years old, what did they find in common with what was predominantly a black movement in the 60s? And I think that period of time brought together two groups who, prior to that time, may not have had a lot obvious in common. But obviously, they felt strong enough that this was a cause that they needed to be united about. So I'm wondering what the panel feels united them in that effort.
I think one of the things that united them was the sense of history that Jews had. We, as Jews, looked at the civil rights movement, looked at what Dr. King was preaching, and not only preaching, but leading, and realized that had there been a Dr. King in the 30s when Jews faced the Holocaust, would things have been different? We have as a religious group, as a people, experienced much of what was going on in the African American community, much of what Dr. King wanted to see done away with, and wanted to see it done away with in terms of being nonviolent, productive, dialogues. All of that we would have loved to have had 30 years before and never did. And realizing this, much of the Jewish community said, it's our turn now to speak out, to join, and to make the alliance that hopefully will help people and will lead to a better world and a better country and a better relationships between all white and black and whomever it might be.
I guess for me, I was a preteen, actually, in those days. And it was interesting. I grew up next door to my grandparents, both of whom were from, well, at that point, Russia or Poland. And they grew up in an oppressed environment. And it was a conversation we had all the time, watching TV, listening about what happened to them and what didn't happen to them and when they lived in Russia and Poland. And why it was so important for us to listen to Dr. King, listen to what was happening with the civil rights movement, and be part of something historical. We suffered, my family suffered from the Holocaust, my family suffered from being split apart in the former Soviet Union. This was a really moving time, and it was something, look at it as a child, it's one of my first memories of that conversation, sitting with my own grandparents.
Let me share one thing with you. In 1962, I was in my fourth year at Hebrew Union College Seminary in Cincinnati. We had biweekly congregations that we went to. My congregation that year was in Birmingham, Alabama. And so I went every other week to Birmingham, and the image has never left my mind. I opened up the Birmingham paper on Sunday morning that I was there, and there is a full-page picture of the chief of police, Bull Connors, never forget his name, and he was beating, I mean viciously beating, two African-American young men. And the paper was actually praising this as, this is the correct thing, not thinking, oh, this is something terrible, horrible. And I realized in the fullest manner possible how terrible things were and how much it just had to change.
Pastor?
Can I first?
Go ahead. I'll yield to my elder statesman.
John's very young.
Yes. This is the second time he's mentioned that, but I wear my age proudly. I've earned every gray hair on my head. But I'll be very brief. For us African Americans, as I got older and joined the movement, I was launched into it after the death of my friend's father. And we had many discussions. And when I went into demonstrations, and I remember a sea of faces, of black and white faces. The white faces were Jews. And one of the things we thought was that white officers would not beat down the Jews. We were in no position to refuse any alliance we were desperate. And we were young, and we talked about that. We thought if they went first, if they were in the lines first, that they would not get beaten down. And I tell you, I was about 14 years old when I saw white policemen beat down Jewish supporters who were in the front line. And you're always afraid in the face of violence. But I tell you, seeing white men beaten down in front of me, what I thought was white men, was far more frightening. Because I thought, if they would beat down a white person, we have no hope. We had no hope at all. Because we knew we were inhuman, we were considered less than human beings. We thought these white fellows were human beings. And so if they would beat them just like us, we had no hope. And I left that scene where many of the adult white males, the Jewish faction, were beaten down. I left, I thought the civil rights movement was over. We were done. They would kill us all.
John, you're up.
Oh. You know, as I canvass the panel, I do realize that I am the youngest on the panel.
That's enough of that, John.
And getting younger every minute.
And to be honest with you, I did not feel adequate to be able to articulate or to even address the historical aspect of the civil rights movement, primarily because I was a child, younger than preteen. However, when I think about and look back, you know, my best friend was Mexican. I had good friends who were white at my elementary school before the white flight thing happened. I grew up in Northern California in the late 60s and 70s, the mecca of change, the place of revolution. And when I look back, I didn't really see black and white until I got a little older. However, I heard the speeches of Dr. King. I heard about, as my parents spoke and shared with us, about the civil rights movement. We would look on television and see the beatings and see that it was not just African Americans, but also whites. I didn't know they were Jews. I just saw white folk. But the thing about it is that they were in this thing together. And during that era, is from a theological perspective, you know, it was where liberation theology, black liberation theology, was birthed out of and utilizing the narrative of the Exodus narrative as the foundation of that liberation theology. So I'm kind of getting ahead of myself because this is going to be part of the next section as far as where we go from here, is recognizing and realizing our similarities, but going back to that era in the 60s and the 70s, it affected a young 7-year-old, 6-year-old just as much as it did, you know, my elders during that time.
Being even younger than the pastor and being an academic on top of it, you know, one of the parts of this discussion of that ideal time is to kind of have those memories. And one of the things I'm actually curious about as I'm listening to particularly the panelists referring to the Jewish experiences, the Shoah, the Holocaust, clearly was an important factor in encouraging it. For some, they were the grandchildren of those who suffered the pogroms in Eastern Europe, so they had that historic memory. But I didn't hear some of the historic memories that happened in the United States. Thousands of lynchings, of course, of African Americans in the late 19th, early 20th century, but also in Atlanta of Leo Frank, a Jew who was lynched, that led to many Jews leaving Atlanta itself, the other cities of Georgia and the South. There was tremendous fear among Jews of where they would fit in, because race and all this is about racism, the dehumanization, as you pointed out, Doctor, of people, so that people themselves started questioning whether they were fully human. It wasn't just that lynching. In 1958, Rabbi Jacob Rothschild in the synagogue in Atlanta spoke up strongly for civil rights, and there was a bombing of that synagogue. It's been popularized in a book called The Temple Bombing. It wasn't an isolated event. There was an attempt to bomb synagogues in Jacksonville, Florida, and other places explicitly to have whites turn against Jews for their supports. but that didn't seem to fit in to your memories. So I'm kind of curious, the ideal time, how did that, some of those other events fit in to your sense of why there was that connection?
I sometimes wonder why I'm invited to these panels. And so I guess I'm here as the contrarian, because, you know, I'll confess up front, I'm 56. I don't know where that puts me in the hierarchy here. And I am the son of I'm a second generation Jew, and my family fled the pogroms of Russia. So that's my experience. I was raised in Chicago, and not that I have a real distinct memory of it, but you know, I guess my mother especially would be labeled as what was sometimes referred to as a limousine liberal. We had Stokely Carmichael to our house. We had there was the Black Panther movement that was that she was involved with, and my father kept his distance from it, but participated. And so there was an ethic that was raised. But you know, to say when is the golden period, I can honestly say when I listen to this and my readings of the subject, there has been a long history from the turn of the century, actually from the start of after the Civil War, of Jewish involvement. But there's also been animosity, and you know, unlike the archaeologist, I am an anthropologist by training, and we look for not the differences, but the commonality of groups. And so, you know, my mother was always fond of saying, it all depends upon whose ox is being gored. And quite honestly, and I don't want to be, again, the contrarian, but when it suited the needs of either community, be it the black or Jewish, they found alliances. But you saw the division taking place, certainly with the Black Power movement in the 60s, and the idea of we want to stand alone. And there was further division after the '67 war, where there was a tremendous Israeli pride. And then there was a greater allegiance that the black movement felt with the Palestinian movement because, again, looking to who they perceived as being oppressed. And I'm not here to say or to pass judgment on it, but that is where you find the commonalities. And so finally, if you want to talk about the golden age, I don't mean to be preachy, but today is the golden age. I look at my office, and I have 43 dedicated public defenders who fight every day the civil rights battle. The civil rights battle isn't necessarily the black versus white, Gentile versus Jew, but it's the oppressed. And that goes back to my original theme that I've discussed in every topic here. It is economic deprivation. Those are the oppressed, and those are the people that we fight for every day. And I don't think it's any different now than, I mean, we're fighting the battle gloriously, as I say.
Actually, Larry, it sounds like you want to be the contrarian. And I think we do want to start looking at that other component of this question. I'll just to clarify, anthropology created the science of the differences of people, but since the early 20th century has fought against it. But one of the key insights that anthropologists have had, because one of the debates on race ends up being, do we talk about race or not talk about race? What anthropologists have come up with quite clearly is there's no biological basis to race. There's no way to create fixed categories of people. You can create categories, but they're always going to be fuzzy. And there's very little that correlates with those categories that's innate to the people. But there's a social reality to race. There's legacies of their oppressive systems of governance, of unequal power relationships that continues to the present day. And so we have that contradiction, paradox at the heart of human differences, particularly in the United States, of recognizing their differences, but they're socially created, which means they can be changed. There was, as the panelists were discussing, so many wonderful examples of people coming together. But due to my youth and my academic background, I look towards books to understanding what happened. And on my shelves, I have books with titles like Blacks and Jews, one of which, from 1992, by Paul Berman, lays out a number of wonderful scholars, both African-American and Jewish-American, laying out what happened. Although I'd love to just kind of go through the academic issues, I want to turn to the panelists and kind of take Larry's challenge. What happened?
And that brings us really to the second part of this discussion, because obviously when we talk about the Golden Age, we talk about that metaphorically. Obviously it was a very difficult period of time. I think from an African American perspective, the common suffering between Jews and African Americans, the Holocaust of the North American slave trade. There's a relationship with groups who have fought oppression for centuries. That being said, the theme of the panel is the relationship between the two groups, and we have to move on to the point where can we say honestly that that relationship is still as strong as the relationship that was forged between Schwerner and Cheney and Goodman, when two Jews and an African American risked their lives in Mississippi and were ultimately murdered for a common cause. Is that relationship as strong as it was in 1964 in Mississippi, or has that relationship frayed? Is it perception or reality? So I think we need to talk about that at this point in our discussion. So whoever wants to handle that, go ahead.
I really adding something to what you said earlier with why we had ties in the 60s was not just in civil rights. Remember, Dr. King spoke on other issues that were very, very important to us. For instance, the war in Vietnam, which brought criticism by some in the civil rights community, but for us it was wonderful. The economic inequality, these are issues that were followed by the vast majority of American Jews. So this made a commonality. But I'd also like to, and I'll throw this out almost as a question, when we talk about the two communities, what we're talking about, are we talking about the leadership of both communities, or are we talking about the real community, the people in the street? Because there's a whole different story when we talk about that. I had the experience of being in Los Angeles in the middle 1980s. And I was working for the American Jewish Congress, which in those days is no longer in existence, primarily concentrated on domestic issues, not international issues, the separation of church and state, of anti-Semitism, of freedom of religion. And so we worked in coalition with a number of African-American civil rights organizations. And we had a very, very close relationship, not only politically, but personally. Then all of a sudden, in 1985, Minister Louis Farrakhan came to Los Angeles and spoke at the Inglewood Forum. And we were taken by surprise. We were in shock of 14,000 cheering people to statements like Judaism is a dirty religion and praising Adolf Hitler as a great man. And as the leadership in the Jewish community, not surprisingly, and I did not consider myself a leader, I was involved in that at the time as an attorney. But what I found is in getting together with African-American friends in the NAACP Los Angeles and Legal Defense, the two organizations of the Urban League, they were as shocked as we were. And one of them was a friend of mine said, you have to realize that there is a tremendous gap between us, the leaders of both communities, and the people we represent, that we have become dangerously out of touch with what they really are feeling. And we came together, we talked, in the Councilman David Cunningham of Los Angeles City Council came to speak to us at the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League. And he said the most amazing thing. He said, we have to step back and realize that the way we, the leaders of both communities, see reality is different from some of our people in the streets. And until we understand where they are, this situation is going to deteriorate because, in a certain sense, Minister Farrakhan has touched a nerve that we have been completely oblivious to for too many years. And I think that's still true. I had the pleasure of hearing Dr. Janetta Cole speak in Atlanta. And she said, if you are, this was in 1990, just 5 years after that, and she said, if you are hurt that we are not participating in dialogue with you, meaning you in the Jewish community, please know that we have issues that are so pressing in our community, like the attack on the African-American male, that is so important to us that we sometimes don't have time to chat. I was hearing things in our community the same way when I was trying to, in my capacity at Congress, to recruit people to get involved in domestic issues. They were saying at that point, we really care more, Rabbi, about the Soviet Union and the Soviet Jews. We really don't care about those issues. And so in many ways, the communities were drifting apart, and she was right about that, in the sense that as important as that dialogue and those relationships where we found them, they were becoming more distant. They were not as close as they were before. And so I think in my experience, we're still dealing with that reality right now.
And again, and I can't speak for all African Americans, but since there are only 3 of us up here, I guess I'm going to have to speak for 1/3. There's no doubt that 2 comments made by 2 so-called leaders caused a rift in the community between African American and Jews. One was the one that you referenced, which was Farrakhan's reference to Hitler and his clarification that he's great, but what I meant, he was wickedly great. It didn't matter. Once you use Hitler in a sentence, you can't take it back. The other was Reverend Jesse Jackson's off-the-record remark when he was running for, I think, president either the first time or the second time, the Hymietown remark. Now, looking at those 2 remarks, there are a couple of fundamental flaws. Number one, that's the assumption that Jesse Jackson and Minister Farrakhan speak for the African American community. One is a leader of the Nation of Islam, which is a very, very small percentage of even the Muslim community in the United States. And then Jesse Jackson's off-the-cuff remark, which, whether it was off the cuff or not, was a terrible remark, assuming that they spoke for an entire community. Both groups, justifiably so, when you have been oppressed and humiliated, like both groups, we are sensitive to any type of criticism. And I think the criticism of Jesse Jackson and Minister Farrakhan by the Jewish community had a backlash, not necessarily because of what the black community felt was true remarks, but because the black community tends to band when their so-called leaders are attacked. And so that rift is really one of the reasons we're having this conversation. The other observation I'll make is that once the concentration of the jointness of our commonality in the civil rights movement was sort of fizzled out because of the gains, then it became an international issue. And one of the things that we do have to talk about from an African American and Jewish perspective is the perception of the Palestinian issue, which many African Americans relate to, admittedly not understanding the complexity of that relationship. So those are the types of issues, I think, and this, again, is my perspective, that has caused not so much a rift, but maybe a misunderstanding. And so I'd be curious as to what the panel feels about that.
Well, I think there are a variety of answers. One of the things that we haven't dealt with that had a great effect within the Jewish community was the whole concept of black power. It was a statement, yes, there were leaders like Farrakhan and others whose statements we didn't particularly appreciate, but the whole concept of black power was, we don't need you anymore. You were part of us, but you're not going down that road with us. And the feeling was in the Jewish community, and since I've now figured out that I'm the oldest person on this panel, please God don't tell my wife, I experienced that, and we weren't accepted. Not only were not accepted, we weren't wanted, and the reason we weren't wanted was because time and time again we were told, it is our problem, meaning the black problem, and we have to deal with it. And yes, you were there at the outset, but you're really not needed anymore. And for the Jewish leaders, they still wanted to be a part of that movement and did everything they could to be a part of that movement. But I must tell you that the Jew in the street said, hey, we're done. We're done. You don't want our participation. You don't want our help. You don't want us being involved anymore. That's fine. We've got other problems, other concerns that we can take care of, and they backed away. And once the Jewish community had backed away, they stayed away. And it wasn't for years that we began to reinvest our time and our effort, both from the black community and the Jewish community, to get ourselves on a whole different plateau. But when the word came, we're going to handle it ourselves, the Jewish community said, fine, go to it.
I think I was coming to age around that time. Yeah, you can laugh at me, but around that time, because of the fact that here again, growing up in the San Francisco Bay Area, in Oakland, Berkeley, I'm saying peace and love, power, flower power, and power to the people, all in the same sentence. The one thing that African American people need to do is take on the paradigm of our Jewish brothers and sisters, and that continue to tell the story, because coming up during that time, it appeared to some that we had overcome, but we still have a long way to go. And the idea of having our own, having a say to speak out on behalf, or as Judge Williams, I'm not speaking for the black community, I'm talking for John Walker right now, to recognize the fact that we do have some sense of power, of identity. But what happened is that you had a generational gap type of thing, if you will, where, okay, we want power, we want our own power, black power. This is the younger generation coming up during that era with the Panthers. But those individuals who really, in the African American community that was really on the forefront with their Jewish brothers and sisters, didn't say, hey, we still need one another. At some point, I guess it felt that the whole civil rights movement at one point was transitioning to another aspect of social, come on, academicians, help me with that. A movement, another movement in the light of what had been taking place, being oppressed and all of that. The story should have continued to be told that there were our Jewish brothers who died. It's not, we need each other. I think we're coming back to that. We're recognizing that, and these type of discussions have to bring that out. You know, yes, we're going to get back, because my grandchildren, yes, I do have them, grandchildren don't see the color issue. If racism is taught, we know that, we hear that. And even within the African American community, we saw that during that 70s and period of, you know, back, I was one. Black, had my red, black, and green button, my dashiki, the whole 9 yards. Even created an African name. But yet, at the same time, my parents instilled in me that all humanity is equal. Although I'm shouting black power, I still had white friends. And because I accepted who I was, and my parents let me know. I remember looking at a Super 8 movie of my family, and my mom's hair was pressed, and my sister's hair was pressed, or permed, whatever y'all want to call it. And I'm saying, we look like Uncle Tom's. That was the last time I said that in front of my mom. What she made me realize, and this is how it's gonna change. It's gonna take education, it's gonna take pulling off the scab, it's gonna take us talking to our young, talking to one another, and saying that, look, we are all in this thing together. But going back to where we were, the whole change, I'm glad Rabbi Howard shared that, because I didn't know. All I knew that during that time, my people were raising up. They were saying, black power, we are proud of who we are. Say it loud, James Brown, you know, the whole 9 yards. And so to hear the stories, because I knew there were, and here again, I didn't see Jew. All I saw was white. Okay, I didn't know you were Jew until you told me you were a Jew. But you could tell I was black. So the whole issue of race and that whole segregation piece, we saw it on television. We were raising up as young people. We were going to do this revolution. We're going to take back what is ours. Yet at the same time, we didn't realize we were leaving those who assisted us through those 60s.
Now, Pastor, I think that was laid out so many good issues I think can take us to another components of these questions. But I want to just kind of touch upon and bring it together some of the issues that were just discussed. Again, going back to Thurgood Marshall. There's actually a story that Ruth Bader Ginsburg tells, who's now in the Supreme Court, but was a lawyer fighting for women's rights in the early 70s. She tells of going in front of the Supreme Courts, and Supreme Court Justice Marshall misspoke and called her Mrs. Goldberg, said Ginsburg. There was a radio show, The Goldbergs. This is actually now a TV show, again, that just came on. And Mrs. Ginsburg says she thought that was sweet, that Mrs. Goldberg was a wonderfully positive character in the radio show, and she took it as a compliment that he misspoke. And I think that's important, because as much as what Jesse Jackson said, what these other people said, we can, if the context is positive, we ignore those comments. They became a lightning rod because of underlying problems. And I think what the pastor was saying is something the Jewish community doesn't always recognize, that the civil rights movement was unbelievably successful for Jews in America. That there were signs in Miami, no Jews, no dogs. There's house deeds for Tampa Bay, a Jew cannot buy this house. Golf courses, tennis courts, not allowed. With the expansion of suburbia, African Americans could not get housing, but Jews could, because of the victories of the civil rights. There's a wonderful study, of course I have to mention a study, right, an academic, a book by an anthropologist, How Jews Became White. And I think that's exactly what you've mentioned, that Jews became white. And I don't think it was so much that people didn't have time to talk to each other, but they were living in different places. That no longer were there Jews and blacks in New York City. There were African Americans in New York City, and the Jews were in Levittown on Long Island. There were differences. There's still, though, and I think these panelists are all here because Larry already started moving us, because we want to see where we want to go. And we know there's inequalities. We want to get to changing it for the better for everyone. So where do we want to go? What do we want to see happening among the Jewish and African American communities? Doctor?
I want to add on that just right before Dr. Renier, and also, are we doing enough from both sides so we can amplify with that? Thank you, Dr. Renier.
Thank you. I've talked personally, but I'm going to talk now, put on my professional hat, but I've tried to leave behind, and talk as a psychologist. To answer some questions, pull some things together, understand that black people came out of the 60s without an identity. There was a book written by Frantz Fanon called Wretched of the Earth, and he was a psychiatrist. And so I'm going to talk personally about that from a psychological point of view. Black people didn't have a holiday. We didn't have a ritual. We didn't have anything that tied us together. We didn't have a language. We didn't have a past history. All of us came from somewhere else in Africa. We could look at each other and not know anything about that history, about each other, that holds us together. What happened after the civil rights movement is that suddenly we had a need to discover those things, create an identity. There was a man named Leroy Jones who changed his name to Imamu Baraka. And he coined the term Kwanzaa, trying to create a holiday. All of us were searching. I remember personally searching for holiday, an identity for us among all my friends. And there's a misnomer that thinking that because we have leaders that somehow they're in our hearts and they know what we're thinking about. None of us really believed Farrakhan. I went to listen. I heard Farrakhan for the first time, and he was an electrifying speaker. Terribly electrifying speaker. Halfway through, I walked away. I said, he's preaching hatred. And many of my friends walked away. He captivated us with truth, and halfway through his speeches, it turned to hatred. To this day, he still uses the same technique. Starts with truth and turns to lies and hatred, and we walk away. That's why he's never grown. Jesse Jackson spoke for us, but didn't know our hearts. And I tell you, in this, I went to Boston University, and if you know Boston University, there's a lot of Jews there. All my friends at Boston University were Jews. I don't remember a time that I didn't have a Jew for a friend. And all this I've heard today, I'm shocked in a sense. Although I know, I read, I know. I'm shocked because I never had a time in which I thought anything but the highest regard for Jews. It was a Jew that brought me to this country. That risked his money to bring me here and my family to this country. It was Jews that, when I was in that front line in Washington, D.C., and the police gave the order to beat us up, it was a Jewish man who fell on top of me as a child to protect me from getting hurt. Never forgotten that.
You need to remember one thing, though, Doctor. When you talk about you went and you heard Farrakhan, and you got up in the middle and you knew it was wrong and you walked out, the Jewish community never heard about anybody that walked out. The Jewish community heard Farrakhan, and Farrakhan spoke of hatred. Farrakhan spoke of how terrible Jews are, and we didn't know any African American or anybody else walked out. So the assumption was made, and it may very well be a very terrible assumption, but the assumption was made, he's speaking for his congregation, and who knows, maybe he is speaking for Black America, and that scared us a great deal, and we said, okay, we're going to back off.
I think it's important to say that having been in the middle of all of that stuff, the amazing support that we got from the African American leadership at the time. Mayor Bradley came out with a wonderful statement. We had members from the civil rights organizations sign on a full-page ad in the Los Angeles Times denouncing those things. But it was so scary at the time, as Rabbi Simon says, that we couldn't, some of us couldn't see that going on. I think also some of the issues that the judge brought up, and yet we're not talking about it, we avoid issues. And one of the issues that will go back is less of one now, when affirmative action to the African American community who had been frozen out for so many decades and centuries, to us, we thought quotas in schools, of anti-Jewish quotas. This is an example of an issue that divided us. It didn't bring us together. Our memories were different. One was seen as a solution to a problem. One was seen as a continuation of a terrible problem. Because when in 1964, when I was at my freshman year of college, Johns Hopkins University had a Jewish quota at the particular time. So these are the kinds of things. As far as the Palestinians, I would like to say this, that sometimes we speak very strongly because of our love for the state of Israel. But you should know, and I'm sure you do, we are not all of one voice on that issue. And there are plenty of Jews, not only here, but in Israel as well, who speak up for the rights of the Palestinians. And I think it's extremely important to know that as well.
Okay, I'll jump in here for a little bit too. I guess, again, a little bit younger. A little bit on the younger side. That's okay, Larry. I grew up in a household where it got beaten into me that language matters. And I'm going to bring it into probably the last 10 or 15 years. I have to tell you, do I feel white? Probably not. Do I feel like a minority? Yes. And just because I'm sitting here as a white person, I've always felt like a minority. And maybe because of the way I grew up, where I grew up, I'm hypersensitive to language, and really damning language. And I think for the last 10 or 15 years as a Jew, it's really hard to watch TV. It's hard to listen to the radio, because there isn't a day that goes by that, just because of what I do, I'm not looking online at leaders around this world using language. You don't like the N-word? I don't like words about me. Calling me a dog, calling me a pig, calling me a lot of language every day. So I'm in a very different position. The hypersensitive side to me is there now. And do I understand the Palestinian issue? Yeah, without a doubt, I really do. I work for a Jewish organization, very supportive of Israel, but I don't live in a void. But part of the problem of where I live is I'm not hearing people speak out. And we have a black president today. We have black leadership in this country. We have Jewish leadership in this country. Where's the leadership of this world when my family had to survive a Holocaust 70-something years ago? My first recollection of really being Jewish was in 1967. I grew up with not a lot of pride. My grandparents fled. They always looked over their shoulders. There was a lot of pride in Jewish households in 1967 that we actually did something on our own, got our hands in the dirt, and we won a war. We, not just Israel, but us. Something's happened for me over the last 10 years, 5 years, that I just find reprehensible. And I'm waiting for people to speak out. It is painful for me every day to go to work and read what I read. So I guess I'll bring it down in a different way. I'm in 2014, and I am watching something happening I can't even believe myself. Language matters. People were belittled in 1933. They were dehumanized. And when we're talking about Palestinians, I'm talking about Jews in Arab countries who were belittled, Jews coming out of countries throughout the world that are belittled. In 2014, where's the leadership speaking up? Where are people speaking up? So for me, I'm bringing this personal, and I'm bringing it home right now. 2014. Anybody know, how many Jews are there in the world? Just curious. We're sitting up here, a little bit of a majority. That's kind of weird here. How many Jews are there in this world? Anybody know? How many? 13, 14 million. We are 0.2% of the world population. 80% of Jews live in 2 countries. But every day on the news, I listen about one country. I listen to people call us names. One country, 0.2%. We're nothing. But it's amazing the world we're living in. So I've been quiet because, again, I grew up in a very different time. I grew up young watching this. But yeah, what can I tell you? I'm going to get emotional about this one. This one bothers me. And one of the reasons I think that we're taking a more active role in bringing dialogue with Christians and Jews, with Jews and blacks, is because it's necessary to talk. And we stayed quiet for way too long. And we've let these things simmer. It's time to open up a little bit of the wounds, but I think it's to open up the world that we're living in today and begin to take it forward.
So when we ask the question, how do we get back? That's a way to get back.
That's the way to get back.
Is to talk.
I think that the last panel discussion we had, the question that was raised, I mean, we're talking Black and Jewish relationship. The last panel we had a representative of the gay, I can't remember the whole LGBT movement. So there are many oppressed, and it is the conversation. And one of the questions that was asked of Dr. Fill me in, Lisa Merritt, you know, and with the idea of a truth and reconciliation, and should there be reparations? And there was kind of a, well, where do we start with reparations? But it is the conversation. It is the honest candor, and it is the belief. It is so nuanced in my eyes. It isn't a black versus Jew, because within the Jewish community, it is so schismed. I mean, when I looked to the African continent, Rwanda didn't differentiate between Tutsis and Hutus when they committed genocide against one another. And we debated in the UN the word genocide. And we stood by and we watched in a matter of weeks more than 700,000 people hacked to death. So, you know, it is the conversation. It is, I'm not looking for revenge in any capacity. I mean, there are, the black community can say that we are owed reparations. The Jewish community can say we're owed reparations. I just want to go forward, and you go forward with the conversation. An honest conversation where you shouldn't be afraid to say what you feel and move on to the next, because that's where you grow. And I hope that this panel does that.
I think we need to move to questions as well, so I think that would be really good before we move out of time. So I think we can amplify some of those, and we'll do a wrap-up. If you have a question, And I think we're answering our question here about dialogue is important. If you would be succinct, and I'm going to repeat the question so we can all hear it. Does anybody have a question they would like to ask the panel? Does the African American community, are you aware of the influx of Ethiopian Jews and blacks coming into Israel?
Well, let me just say that there's a danger speaking for the entire African American.
Right, exactly. Exactly.
Thank you.
And the Jewish community. I'm Episcopalian, in case you know. One of the issues, and again, I can't speak for the whole community, and one of the problems is the lack of communication. And I'm going to speak in generalities. We don't know the nuances of what's going on in that area of the world. We don't know all of the political issues. What African Americans, and I think what Jews can relate to, are sufferings by people, of oppression by people. As an African American, there's a natural sympathy for any group that has the perception of being perceived as being oppressed, because we were oppressed for so many years, born and sold into slavery for so many years, that there's a natural empathy. The issue is educating us about that situation. So if we see a group of people who appear to us to be suffering, who appear to be like us before Brown versus Board of Education and were treated differently than other citizens, there is a natural sympathy. Again, because of the lack of dialogue, because of the lack of understanding, and I think this may segue into how I would like to end this conversation, because we don't know, because we don't ask, and we aren't being told what the minutia that makes that situation in the world so complex. So we do have a natural sympathy. We do have a knee-jerk reaction when we see it. We do relate to what we see because of how we were treated, but there's an asterisk. The reason that we may react to it is because we have not had a dialogue and we don't understand the nuances. And we hope that situations like what we're having today can take us to that level of understanding. But I can tell you, everyone on this panel is probably too old, and it is our hope, that somehow from this, we begin to get educated at a much younger age.
Even Howard is too old. It's interesting to get.
And to hopefully answer the young lady's question,
I did avoid that.
Judge Williams basically hit it on the head. It's going to take education. Some of our, I can't speak for the entire African American community, individuals that I know about it. It takes individuals upon themselves to investigate, but it is my role as a cleric in the community to educate and to teach. I had the opportunity with Rabbi Howard to go visit the Ethiopian camp in Israel, in Haifa, I think it was. We were
Kiryat Yam.
Kiryat Yam. Yeah, and the relationship that they had with me was different than, what how we greeted one another. It was that this is a person from the motherland. This is an African. This one I can relate to. He looks like me. I look like him. And so when they greeted the other members of the group, Howard was there with us. It was different when I greeted them. It was more like a brotherly thing. It was like a connection. And it's going to take my educating my community as well as others to get that out.
Dr. Renier, can you add in on that?
Sure. I think that the African American community knows about Ethiopians being, Jewish Ethiopians being accepted into Israel. It's pretty common knowledge. I don't think among the people themselves there's as much rift as we've heard around here. I don't think that is true. And I agree with Judge Williams. I learned something very young from my almost all Jewish teachers at BU, that oppression is wrong. Oppression colors our thinking, It colors our experiences. It divides us. Slaves who were being killed and being beaten held angry feelings against other slaves for getting a little bit more food or spared a beating that day. Likewise, today, we live in an oppressive world. African Americans are not as free as you think. 85% of the people in prison are people of color, and the prisons are growing. 2 million people in America, most of it people of color. 2 million people incarcerated in America, and we accept it. Unemployment among African Americans here is unprecedented. It's 25% or higher. Lack of education, it's almost a cliche, because they're failing out of schools in Florida at 44% and higher. Things are not so great. We do have some leaders. We do have some people like me who can speak, and it sounds like, because you can hear me, you can see me, you think that things are okay. They're not okay. There's a cancer growing in America of poor, oppressed people. And because of that, we tend to fight over it. We want to deny it. We don't want to accept it. We want to make up stories to cover it up. And we do, until the day when one of them, a charismatic leader, is born who ignites it. That ignition is coming. Now, we may not want to see that ignition. I'm not looking forward for another revolution. The world is in the same place. It's in the same mess. The problem with this world is that information flows everywhere all the time, instantly, to such a point you don't have time to analyze it. We hear and see people suffering almost at the time that it's happening. That's affecting us. All of us are living with some post-traumatic stress. And I hear that in this panel. We all have had experiences. It's not really about a movement, it's about individual experiences. And each of us have powerful experiences through the journey of life. And sometimes we need to stop and look at each other and say, you hurt, I hurt. We have things in common. Maybe we should stop the hurting today. That's all we can do, just today. That's what I want to do, stop it hurt today. I'll go along with that.
Yeah, I think one of the nice things about this play is the ability for this to happen, for this dialogue to happen, for us to talk between not only blacks and whites, but within the interfaith community. John had an incredible article or a quote over the weekend. Right. And it's something you'd want to talk about, because when I read it the other day, it kind of like stopped me in my tracks. Sitting at my table on a Sunday morning reading that, and it's like, oh my God, I live here. I live in paradise. We go out, golf is over here. It's absolutely beautiful, but we tend to forget, and that's one of the reasons why I think this is so important.
Could you repeat that quote?
Like to have you say something about what you said.
Would you say the quote?
I don't know which quote he's talking about.
It's about church on a Sunday morning.
Church on Sunday.
It's not mine. I'm not going to claim it, but even here in the 21st century, the most segregated hour of the week is during the time when people go to church on Sunday morning. Blacks go to their church, whites go to their church. They're praying to the same God, and as I would say, lifting up holy hands, but not giving a helping hand. And in the context of an African American church, getting our praise on, but not doing anything to bring about a change in society. Since y'all gave me this time, I'm going to speak. My whole foundation of my theology is that God created humankind in His image, not Jew, not Christian, not black nor white. Humankind. And rabbis, y'all help me with that passage if hopefully I'm correct, close to it. And once you grasp a hold of that, one of my professors in seminary who taught being human, who wrote a book on being human, he said, I cannot be human until I see the humanity in you. And by seeing the humanity in you as being created by God, then I am human. and therefore seeing the reflection, not to say you're godly, but to see the reflection of one who is created by the Creator, and recognizing that and accepting that, then I too am human. And once we grasp hold of that concept, that we are all created equal in the eyesight of God, that we are all in this thing together, quoting Dr. King, there is no Jew or Gentile, slave or free, male nor female, black or white. I'm going to add some more stuff with it later on. But the thing is that we are all here together, and the assumptions that many people have is primarily based upon presuppositions and ignorances that we tend to gain from listening to, I want to say, the media, for the most part, because that's where we get our information, and that's what we hold fast to. Go out and talk to somebody. Find someone that that's not of your faith tradition or your race. I don't even like the word minority, Howard, because it's a term to me that makes one feel inferior to one who says, I'm the majority inferior. There is no minority or majority. I know we talk about that, and that's what society has led us to believe, but if we recognize the fact that we are all equal, that we are all the same, that we are all created by the same Creator, then we are all one people.
Let me add one thing. We mentioned
Rabbi has always got to talk after the Christian.
Well, I always have. We talked about Howard talked about picking up the paper and reading John's statement. Well, because of what we have done together in building our relationship, and it's been through the Federation, and it's the Federation that we give thanks to. I picked up that Monday morning paper, and I'm looking at John's picture, and I read the article, and I said, oh, I got to get a hold of my buddy. I go to the computer, flip it on, and tell him how great it was to start my morning and see my man John right there and listen to him. Well, if we didn't have what we have begun to build within our federation of an outreach to the entire community, Jewish, non-Jewish, if we didn't have the programs that we have and the interest and the devotion, I wouldn't have been able to make that email. I wouldn't have recognized John. Now, this is my buddy. This is my friend and my partner in traveling. It's a whole different understanding, a whole different perspective. It's that perspective we've got to build on, expand on, and see it grow throughout our community.
He introduced me to Jewish soul food. I'm going to give him some greens and coffee.
Judge, you want to take us out?
I want to sort of wrap everything up in the spirit of the play Thurgood. Those of you who haven't seen it, see it. Those of you who have seen it, it's a personal play for me, and I think people get different things out of it. But at the end of the play, to me, what Thurgood Marshall is saying is that we have laid this table out for America. We have ended the most notorious system of institutionalized racism, and that was Jim Crow legal segregation. It is up to us as Americans at this point to carry on what Thurgood Marshall laid out for us. And hopefully through dialogue such as this, hopefully through coming together as a community, we can realize his dream for one united America. So on that, Kate, I thank you for putting this on. I thank the panel. I thank the audience for coming out to see it. And again, we appreciate your support. Thank you.
And I'd like to thank Uzi Baram for co-moderating. And an extraordinary, we really could have had about 3, 4, 5 hours in breakout sessions. But thank you very much, and we'll see you at the theater.